Today we're talking about ignorance. We saw in our lecture in class that ignorance is a moral impediment. It's one of those things that gets in the way of our living a moral life. It affects our living a life of grace, and it can even get in the way of sin, lessening our responsibility for our sins. So let's remind ourselves what the list of impediments are. We've seen this before as well, that there are a list of 6 different impediments. We have the impediment of fear. We have the impediment of duress. We have inadvertence, inordinate attachments, and the impediment of habit. Today we're taking a look at the question of ignorance and how there are 3 types of ignorance and what each one means. The 3 types of ignorance that we're going to look at are invincible ignorance, vincible ignorance, and affected ignorance. So here they are, the 3 types of ignorance. We have invincible ignorance, and you have to pay really close attention to the beginning of that word, invincible ignorance. We have vincible ignorance. And then we have affected ignorance. Unlike the ways in which these words are used normally day in and day out on the street corners or at the mall, there are different types of being ignorant. There's different types of not knowing something. And if you don't know something, if you don't have knowledge, it can get in the way of morality, and it can also get in the way of your responsibility for sins that you may be committing. Invincible ignorance is when we don't know something and there's no possible way that it could be known. This is one of those things that are hard to grasp. What it essentially means is there is no way I could have ever possibly known. There's no way that someone could have ever known something. In this case, if somebody suffers from invincible ignorance, whatever they don't know can't be morally held against them. They can't be responsible for what they don't know and what they can't know. The first type of ignorance is invincible ignorance. Maybe you know what the word invincible means. Sometimes it's a less used word. So here's what it means. It's when you do not know something. This is the normal idea of ignorance. But the second part is when it's not possible. You can't possibly know something. There's no way you could know what you need to know for the moral life. When it comes to invincible ignorance, we don't hear the word used that often except maybe in fairy tales. People sometimes talk about invincible dragons that are so powerful that they could never be killed or destroyed. This is a good way to remember this because when we have an invincible ignorance, there's no way to destroy the ignorance. There's no way to undo the ignorance. There's no way to stop being ignorant or to come to knowledge that we need. So if you're facing invincible ignorance like an invincible dragon, all moral responsibility is gone because there's just no way to ever know. So an example of this is a fairy tale that's often told to little children about an invincible dragon, as you see fighting the knight there with his sword and shield. If something is invincible, it can't be defeated, it can't be conquered, it can't be killed or overcome. So if you're talking about an ignorance that can't be overcome, then the responsibility that somebody has for that ignorance goes away because there's no way that they could know. There's no way that they could learn what they don't know. There's no way that their ignorance could be overcome. Now, the opposite of invincible ignorance is vincible ignorance. The opposite of invincible ignorance is vincible ignorance. So if you saw someone with vincible ignorance, they don't know something, but they can know. In other words, their ignorance, their lack of knowledge, can be overcome. Now, the opposite of invincible ignorance is vincible ignorance. As you see, there's no in negating the word vincible. So vincible is obviously, again, when you don't know something. That's ignorance. But the difference between these two is invincible ignorance, it's actually possible to know when we can know something. So our ignorance becomes our own fault. So if vincible ignorance gets in the way of sin, we may not be responsible for the sin, but we are responsible for the ignorance. This is the most common expression of vincible ignorance, ignorance that somebody could actually get over. We hear people say this all the time as a response, a quick response to questions about, do you know what the homework was? Did you study? Where is your iPad? Did you bring a pencil? We say, I don't know, when in fact you should know. So maybe you're not responsible for the fact that you don't know where the pencil is, but you should know. Therefore, you're responsible for your ignorance. It's an ignorance that you could overcome, so the responsibility for the sin or the fault is still yours. The final type of ignorance that we're going to look at today is called affected ignorance. And this is a little bit different than vincible or invincible. Invincible ignorance is where you don't know and there's absolutely no possible way you could ever know. You're not responsible for that ignorance. You're not responsible for the sin that comes from that ignorance. Invincible ignorance, you don't know, so you're not responsible for the sin, but you should know, therefore you are responsible for the ignorance. Now, here's the worst type of ignorance. This is called affected ignorance. And affected ignorance is a little bit different because, again, you don't know something just like before. You could know something very similar to vincible ignorance, but here's the difference. You don't want to know, and you actually try to remain in your ignorance. Let me show you an example. All right, so here's an example of affected ignorance. Let's say you've got a great job and you find that you're working for the mafia. But not only are you working for the mafia, you've got a special. So your special job is the accountant for the mafia. You work for them, they give you their money, and you, because of your ignorance, don't know where the money comes from. You don't know what awful things were done to get the money. You don't know what sins were committed, what was stolen, what was robbed, who was killed. All you know is that it is money that certainly comes from bad means. However, because you're making a lot of money yourself, you choose to remain ignorant. And you tell your boss, don't tell me where the money comes from. I don't want to know. I want to stay ignorant. That's called affected ignorance. When you don't want to know, to remain in your ignorance, that is a very, very serious sin. And you, in that instance, remain responsible for the ignorance, and because you're trying to stay ignorant, you also become responsible for the sin. So let's review. The three types of ignorances are invincible, vincible, and affected. Now, ignorance, again, is when you don't know something. And that ignorance, if you don't know something is wrong, then It gets in the way. It's again called a moral impediment. It gets in the way of your moral responsibility when you commit a sin. If you don't know that lying is a sin and you lie, as ridiculous as that seems, everyone knows that, but if you don't know that it's a sin to lie and you lie, well, then it's not a sin for you because you're ignorant. But there are the three types again: invincible, vincible, and affected. Invincible ignorance is ignorance that you can't fix, right here. You can't fix it. It can't be changed. There's no way you could ever come to know what you don't know. So you're never responsible for the sin that comes through invincible ignorance. Now, vincible ignorance, you can fix. You can know something. So you're not responsible for the sin, but you are responsible for the ignorance. Therefore, there's moral guilt in regards to the ignorance. Affected ignorance is where you don't want to fix the ignorance. So not only are you responsible for the sin, unlike the other two, you are actually responsible for the sin, but you're also responsible for your ignorance because you're trying to remain ignorant. So finally, as you review through what you've taken notes on, review the video, review the content of the video, go back and re-watch what you need to watch. You can rewind, pause, take notes, remember the examples, and most importantly, study for the quiz. Thank you so much.